There's a lot to love about fishing big rivers. For one thing, you can usually cast without getting snagged on a tree. There's room for lots of anglers to spread out, and oh, yeah, the fish can be absolutely enormous. But if you started out your fly fishing career on smaller streams, making that jump to big rivers can feel really intimidating. Where do the fish hold? Where should you cast? And are they even eating the same bugs as they do in small streams? Well, this week on Untangled, we're going to answer all those questions and tons more. You're going to end this show ready to hit the big rivers and have success. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Happy to be back for yet another week of podcasting excellence. And this week, we're talking about big rivers, how it can be a little intimidating sometimes to go out and dip your toes into this part of the fly fishing world, especially if you're like me and you grew up and started your fly fishing out on smaller rivers and streams. You go to that big river for the first time, and it's overwhelming, maybe a little bit scary sometimes, but it really, I think overwhelming is probably the best word to describe it, because you just pull up and there's so much water. There's so many places a fish could be. It's almost decision paralysis. You can't decide where to fish because it either all looks really good or it's just featureless almost. You can't really decide where the fish might be hanging out. And I remember that's exactly how I felt the very first time that I ever went to fish a big river. I don't remember when this was. It was years ago. But I just remember that, again, first trip to a big river that wasn't in Utah or with a guide. So it was my first time on my own to a big river. Because I did grow up fishing the Green River in Utah, which is a pretty big piece of water. But so I was familiar with that. But we came up to Wyoming, my buddy and I, on a Saturday. We were just going to fish for the day. It was probably right about this time of year, actually, because I remember it was cold, it was snowy, and it was windy. Which, I mean, that's Wyoming for the entire year, except for the 1 week in July that we call summer. But it was not great weather. And my buddy and I remember we pull up to the river, and it's just this massive, sprawling thing. Is the best way that it stood out in my mind. And what I really remember the most from this was that it looked all the same. There was nothing that gave me any hope of thinking, oh, look, I know what that is. That's a pocket or that's a seam. I had no clue about any of this stuff, and I couldn't pick out anything in this river that looked fishy, except for there was one spot where there were 3 boulders or maybe 4 sticking up through the water, and that was the only kind of feature in the water. The rest of it was just this big, featureless blob of water. And we spent all day just trying to figure out where we even wanted to cast. I know we did not catch anything that day. We got skunked. And I remember vividly walking with my buddy up and down the river looking for good water. That's what we kept saying. Well, we got to go. I bet there's good water up around the corner. So we'd wait up around the corner, and neither of us could find water that we felt like had any fish in it. Nothing screamed out to us as, hey, fish me, because we both came from small stream backgrounds. So we go to this big river, and we just spent all day. I think we threw maybe 7 or 8 casts all day. It was very discouraging. It was very frustrating, especially because this river has a reputation for putting out big fish. So we thought we'd go there and catch a few of them, and it was just completely overwhelming. Well, fast forward to now, and that river is probably my second or third favorite all time that I've ever fished. And I've had the opportunity to fish a lot of places in my life, and I love this place so much. And I feel as comfortable fishing there now as I do on the small creek behind my house where I live these days. I've landed a 25-inch rainbow on that river, some really nice cutthroat, some cool brown trout, really big whitefish. It's become just really a go-to place for me. And I credit the hard knocks that I learned on that river for teaching a majority of what I know about fishing big rivers and learning how to decode big water. And while I was putting the prep together for this week's show, I boiled all of that down, why I feel comfortable on big rivers, the lessons I've learned. I boiled all of that down and came up with 5 key points that if you remember these and you utilize these the next time you're out on a big river, it's going to help you succeed. It's going to help you not feel like you're tackling this insurmountable task of fishing a big sprawling piece of water. It becomes a lot more manageable when you keep these 5 things in mind. And the first one is, this might be kind of frustrating to hear, because I've said this to a few people and they've said, well, that's not helpful. So I'm going to really go in depth here. But the first one is that you've got to remember the big rivers are the same as a small stream. It's just a lot bigger. Now, again, I know on the surface that doesn't sound too helpful, but what I mean by that is that on a small stream, you will often run into the classic trout stream setup where the water is moving through a riffle, which is a shallow section with a lot of chop on top of it. Then it goes into a run, which is a little bit deeper, a little bit less surface disturbance. And then it goes into a pool, which is deep and slow moving. Sometimes it's crystal clear and you can see all the fish at the bottom of it. But that riffle run pool progression of a river as it moves through wherever it's flowing, it's a pattern that's very familiar on trout rivers. And you see this over and over and over again, especially on smaller streams. But on small streams, that change from riffle into a run into a pool tends to happen fairly quickly. All right. As an example, one of my favorite streams here out behind my house, that pattern is represented through this huge meadow for miles and miles. Okay, the stream just goes riffle, run, pool for miles as it snakes through all these willows. But it'll go from riffle to a run to a pool. It'll complete that entire cycle in like 50 or 60 feet in some places. They're very short, very small, very distinct holes. And since the water changes quickly and it's smaller, those changes tend to be very abrupt and they're pretty easy to pick out. Even if you're new to fly fishing, it's obvious that, hey, the river is changing here. It's a little deeper here. It's shallower there. And you can make those connections very quickly on this smaller water. Now, that same pattern is going to play out on bigger rivers, just on an extraordinarily larger scale. It's kind of like, I'll go get wings with somebody and we'll go to a place and they'll order the 6 or the 8 count bone-in wings. And I just kind of look at them and smile. Oh, I remember my first wing time, and I order the 20 or 30 piece platter because, if I'm going to be good at something in my life, it's going to be eating wings because it sure ain't fly fishing. But anyways, on a bigger river, to bring that metaphor completely home, on a bigger river, that change from riffle to run to pool can happen over the length of a football field instead of just 50 or 60 feet. Now, that doesn't mean that every big river is like that. There's one that I love to fish not too far from here where the changes are pretty quick. They're pretty abrupt. The pools are big, but the riffles and runs, they're very easy to pick out. It's not a big sprawling mess like the Henry's Fork of the Snake or even parts of the Madison if you've fished either of those rivers. Okay. So the key here is to train yourself to look for those changes over a much larger area of water. So look for the change from riffle to run to pool over a much larger area than you would on a small stream. Now, the reason why you should do this is because you've got to cover a lot more water in a big river anyways, just by virtue of how much larger it is. You're going to be covering more water to find the fish. But once you start to recognize how large the changes are and how big the riffles are and how big the runs are and how big the pools are, what you're able to do is then chunk that river up into a lot more manageable sections and then fish those thoroughly and work your way through them. If you're not really in the mood to nymph deep and you think the fish are going to be in the runs or the riffles, you can you find that run, you find that riffle, and then you just focus on that. You cover that very in depth. You don't worry about the abrupt changes from riffle to run or from run to pool. You just focus on the one water type, give it your best shot, and then move on to the next one. You can just kind of chunk things up a little bit. I found it's a good mindset change to make where you focus on fishing those different types of water. Just again, by realizing they're going to be larger. Okay, these changes are going to happen over bigger chunks of area. And once you realize that, I've found it's become easier for me to break these rivers up into those more fishable size chunks. And then just to really drive this point home, there's this small stream that I love to fish back in Utah. It's probably the only small stream I miss from Utah. Now, that's not true. There's a couple more that I miss, but I really do miss this one because it's just so much fun. And there's one section where there's a really nice riffle run pool setup because most of the rest of the river pocket water because it's flowing through a pretty steep canyon. But that entire section, riffle run pool, is maybe 60 feet long. The pool is about 40 feet of that, and the riffle and run are both very short. Again, that entire riffle run pool stretch is maybe 60, 70 feet at most. Okay. But then on this big tailwater that I fish near my house, I fished a pool last Saturday that's literally, it's the length of 2 city blocks. And I know that because the river flows through town, so I can measure it that way. But this just drives that point home. The features that you're fishing are the same. They're just a lot bigger in these bigger rivers. That pool was 2 city blocks long instead of 40 feet. Okay. It's the same stuff. You just got to go on a bigger scale. All right. And if you're hearing me talk about these riffles and these runs and these pools, and it sounds like I'm talking Greek, I completely understand. So we actually put together an ebook about reading water, about how to find all of these different water types in a river so you know where the fish are most likely to hang out. It's completely free. It's our Finding Fish ebook, and I will link that down in the show notes if you'd like to grab a copy of it for yourself, or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. And we are going to move right on to tip number 2, and that is all about fly selection. Okay? Your fly selection, for the most part, is going to be the same in a big river, as it is on a small stream. Because I know a lot of folks worry about this. They think, I'm going to this big river, the flies are going to be so much different. And for the most part, that's a pretty misplaced worry. I see this question, we get this question a lot from anglers where, like, oh, I'm going to this big river and I don't know if my flies are going to work. Well, trout are trout. Fish are fish, okay? They're going to be eating the same bugs as fish in small streams, okay? The main differences you're going to see are the fact that a lot of your larger tailwaters, which are rivers that flow out from beneath a dam, they're going to have pretty big populations of crawfish or crawdads, whatever you call them. They might have a lot more bait fish like sculpins or maybe some red-side shiners, little smaller bait fish like that for the other fish to eat. They'll have generally larger populations of those than smaller streams will do. So that's really one difference. But by and large, if the caddis are coming off on your local small stream, they're going to be coming off on the local big river too, because these hatches occur at specific times of the year. And yes, there can be a little bit of influence, and I'll get into that in just a sec on timing, but you don't really need to change your fly selection all that much, okay? As far as timing goes with these, the big factor that's going to determine when the hatches come off is whether this big river is a tailwater, which again is the water that flows from beneath a dam. So there's a big reservoir above it, and the water's coming out from the dam, and it stays at a constant temperature year round. And then a freestone. So freestone is entirely fueled by springs, snow, and runoff melt. So its water levels fluctuate a ton, and the water temps can fluctuate a bunch during the year in a freestone. The tailwaters, since their water is so cold and consistent year round, the hatches are very predictable. almost down to the day sometimes, depending on weather a little bit, but almost down to the day when the hatches will start and when they'll end, because the aquatic insects get on a very nice calendar in places like tailwaters. And then the freestones, depending on how warm or cold it was, how much water you had, how little water you had, the timing on the hatches and the freestones could be a little different. Again, it depends. There'll be local variants wherever you're fishing. But other than the timing and maybe a slight difference in the bait fish populations, you're going to be fishing very similar flies both in your big rivers and your small streams. You might be going to smaller flies in the big river because maybe it's more pressured and the fish are very picky and they only want to eat the small stuff. They might prefer to eat nymphs more, or if there's a really big crawdad population in that river, they might love your crawdad imitations more so than on the small streams. But again, I'm lucky to live near two pretty big tailwaters and then a bunch of small streams. And when the caddis are coming off on the small streams, they're also coming off on both tailwaters, both big tailwaters. And I'm able to go fish caddis everywhere at that time. So you don't have to make too many huge changes. There might be some local flavor on flies every now and then, but by and large, the same flies you're using on your small streams are going to be just fine in your big rivers as well. The third thing to focus on is the seams. Okay, we're going to go back to building off of point one for a second here. Seams are a water feature, and that's where fast and slow water meet. They'll come together. You'll usually be able to pick these seams out very easily because you'll have a lot of slow water, a lot of fast water, and then there will be a bit of turbulent water in between them with some foam on it, and that's going to be your seam. And fish love to hang out on seams. The seams are to fish what buffets are to me. Okay, we're gonna move heaven and earth to get to that buffet, especially if they got prime rib, wings, and good rolls. You bet we're gonna park ourselves there for a long time. And the fish feel the exact same way because they can hang out in that slow water. They don't have to exert very much energy at all. But then when they want to eat, they can zip out into the fast water, eat the steady stream of aquatic insects that's getting pushed down in that current, and then they can go back into the slow water and kick their fins up on their little trout recliners, watch some trout football, or whatever it is the fish are doing down there. So they love hanging out on these seams. So when you get to a new big river and maybe you still don't feel comfortable about identifying riffles or fishing runs or pools or what have you, and you want to keep it as simple as possible, just look for the seams and go fish those seams because the fish are going to stack up in them. They're going to hang out in those seams pretty much year round, and you'll be able to catch quite a few fish just nymphing those seams, sometimes even fishing dry flies in the seams, depending on the time of year and what's going on. But the seams are just hands down one of the most consistently productive places on any river, but especially because they're a lot easier to see on bigger rivers because the seams are so much bigger. You can really set up shop there and do pretty well for yourself. There was another bigger river that I used to fish back when I lived in Utah, and there was this beautiful seam where there's this big boulder next to the bank, and the boulder made this huge pocket, probably 100 yards long. And then you had the main current moving off to the other side of the boulder, and this beautiful seam between that pocket and the main current. And fish would sit in that seam, and they would arise when the blue-winged olive mayflies were out, when the caddis were out, basically when anything was hatching. They would just rise in that seam, just go nuts for dry flies. And I could just park at the bottom of the seam and fish my way up with a dry dropper. And as long as I got a decent presentation, I was into quite a few fish consistently. And it got to the point where I almost got bored of fishing that seam because it was so productive and so good. So I finally ventured up and looked at some other places on the river and found other spots that were just as productive. Okay. But what they all shared in common was that they were all seams. It was all places where the fast and slow water met and the fish is stacked up there. And that's still usually what I will do when I go to a new big river that I haven't fished before. I've found that I tend to gravitate towards fishing the seams first, just because they do tend to be so productive. So definitely watch out for the seams. Spend some time on those. I bet you'll surprise yourself a little bit at what you find. Tip number 4, we're going to get into. Don't worry about the middle of the river. One extremely common mistake I see a lot of newer anglers make on bigger rivers is that they're always trying hard to cast as far as they can. It's like they want to cast all the way to the backing on their fly reel. They want to get their flies out to the middle of the river, even if the middle of the river is a bunch of white water, a bunch of rapids, and the current's just ripping. There's this belief that all the fish are out in the middle, especially in a big river, and you got to get out to the middle. Usually, that's just not the case. Unless you run into a mid-river seam, a pool, or maybe a long, long riffle where the fish can be evenly dispersed across the whole thing. But most of the times, that's just not the case. And to illustrate this point, I want you to think for a second, last time you're on the water where there were drift boats on the river, or maybe you were watching a video on YouTube. The drift boats are coming down the river. Where are they fishing to? Think about that for a second. They're casting to the middle, or are they casting to the banks? Yeah, chances are, unless they're floating through that really long riffle, or they're hitting a mid-river feature, a seam or a little pocket behind a boulder or something, chances are they're tossing their rigs a lot closer to the banks instead of out towards the middle. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but the main one is that the water along the banks is moving slower than the water out in the middle of the river. Because as the water hits the bank, all that friction forces it to slow up. And trout want to expend the least amount of energy for the most amount of food possible. So they are going to hold where the water is moving as slow as possible while they can still eat a ton of food. Now, when a big hatch is on, they'll move into those riffles. Even though they're moving very quickly, they'll move into the riffles because there's so much food when the hatch is happening in those riffles in particular that they can consume more calories than they burn. Okay. Fish really have the whole dieting thing figured out. There's a reason you don't see Trout Ozempic advertised on ESPN at 10 in the evening when you're watching college football on a Saturday night, because they don't need it. They've got it figured. They've got calories in, calories out, down to a friggin' science. And honestly, I'm kind of jealous of them. Maybe that's why fish oil is such a popular supplement these days. I don't know. But anyways, the fish are more than likely going to be closer to the banks than you realize, because a lot of your features are going to be there. You're going to have seams, you're going to have pockets, you're going to have runs that are going to be close to either bank, whichever side of the river that you're on. The exception to this will be maybe a section of the river where it narrows up, and so the heart of the run is closer to the middle, or that big riffle, like I mentioned, where the whole river, just bank to bank, is one giant riffle, and so the fish are evenly dispersed through the whole thing. Or maybe it's a river a bit more like the Madison, where there's a lot of boulders, there's a lot of pockets everywhere, and so you can kind of pick your line and just fish that all the way down the river instead. Unless those conditions are met, you're going to be a lot better off focusing on that relatively simple, easy casting range within 30 to maybe 50 feet max of the bank on most big rivers. And tip number 5 to remember is that the flows in the river are going to push the fish. So when a river is running at a high flow relative to what they normally run at, so let's say the river normally runs at 1,000 CFS, but it's at 1,500 CFS now. And CFS just stands for cubic feet per second. It's a way to measure how much water is moving down the river. And you can find river flow information online if you just type in my local creek river flow. You can usually find some website that's tracking the flow of that water. And if the water is higher than normal, if you're during a high water moment where it's spring runoff, for example, all of that water is going to rise up and it's going to push the fish out towards the edges, because the river, remember, the river's flowing a lot faster. So they get pushed, those fish get pushed out of their favorite holding lies further from the bank, and they get pushed closer to the bank where that friction is, where they can find the calmer water and just hang out there. So they'll be pushed up and closer to the bank. It's frustrating sometimes when high water comes because it is a little tougher to fish because it's so quick. You've got to get down deep, but it's sometimes a little easier to find where the fish are because they're just pushed so close to the bank in a lot of instances. Now, my local tailwater, it will fluctuate quite a bit in flows from spring through summer thanks to some downstream irrigation. So in June, it'll be running at like 1,700 CFS, even up to 2,100 CFS sometimes. But then it drops to like 600 CFS in the winter. So there's this huge jump in flows. And in June, you'll go up and fish it, and the fish are all tight to the banks. Last June when I got to fish it, I didn't get to fish this June because we were in Utah with my daughter when she was born. But before the year before that June, I was fishing, and it was one of the best months of fishing I'd ever had on this river. But I think I caught 99% of the fish that June within like 10 feet of the bank because the water was high and the fish were pushed nice and tight to the bank. Now, when the water drops, like it has now, because it's running at 600 CFS right now, they're going to congregate in those deeper runs and those pools, and they're going to move in and out of the riffles to eat a dry fly hatch when the hatch starts coming off. So the fish are going to move around quite a bit depending on the flows. So that's something else to keep in mind when you go. It can be good to just check and see, all right, is the river running a lot faster than it normally, or a lot higher than it normally does? Is it running lower? And that'll give you a gauge of maybe where to expect those fish. But again, if you focus on the banks, like we talked about with tip 4, you don't have to worry too much about that. So those are your 5 tips. Hopefully they shed some light on big rivers and you feel ready to go out and tackle them and grab them by the tail and put them in your pocket, as the philosopher Matt Foley once said. But if you've got any more tips or any questions about big rivers, please drop them in a comment so I can get to them. I'd love to answer any more questions that y'all have. But speaking of questions, we are going to run to the Q&A section of the show this week. Every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, you go ahead and send those in. There's a link to do that down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. Deanne from Colorado has got our first question, writes in and says, if a fish jumps while you're fishing with a barbless hook, what should I do to increase my odds of keeping the hook set? Deanne, this is a great question. Thanks for sending it in. I actually had a chat with a buddy of mine just last week about this. We were out fishing, and we were talking about how some of our guide friends that we know, they still don't use barbless hooks. Even though barbless hooks are much better for the fish, they go in easier, they slide out easier, and they're a million times better for you. I don't know if you've ever hooked yourself or hooked your clothes with a barbed hook, but man, those barbless hooks, it just slides right out. There's no pain. There's no screaming and weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. None of that nastiness. But anyways, the guides that we know that still don't use barbless hooks, they usually keep the barbs on because, according to them, it's easier for clients to stay hooked up with the trout if the hooks are barbed. And, honestly, that's just a load of crap. That's really the best way to put it. Because, yes, it's easier for somebody who doesn't know what they're doing to stay hooked into a fish with a barbed hook. There's really not too much denying that. But the barbed hooks are nowhere near as good for the fish as the barbless hooks are. I was out fishing Saturday with this buddy that I was talking about, and we were out together, and I hooked, 10, 11 fish maybe? I can't remember. But every single one of those fish, as soon as I got those fish in the net and I let the tension off the line, the hook slid right out. It was amazing. I wasn't fumbling to pull the hook out. I wasn't trying to keep the fish wet the whole time. The hook just literally pops out as soon as the tension comes off. It's amazing. It's so much better for the fish. And that's why it's hard for me to wrap my head around folks who still use the barbed hooks, especially guides when you're catching that many fish. It's just so much better in so many ways to use barbless. And And that's why, if you teach somebody how to properly fight fish, it's not going to matter if they're using barbed or barbless, they'll be able to keep those fish on. The key to not losing fish, regardless of whether your hook is barbed or not, is to keep constant tension on that line during the fight. With barbed hooks, you're going to have a lot more room for error here. You can let off the tension a little bit and it won't slide right back out like a barbless one will. But that really doesn't help you in the end either, because it's going to teach you bad habits. The last thing you want is to get comfortable doing it the wrong way and then hook into that trout of a lifetime and the hook slides out even if it's barbed because you didn't have enough tension on it for whatever reason. So I think barbless hooks teach you to be a better angler right from the get-go, because you can't have that room for error when you're fighting the fish. You have to make sure your tension is spot on and consistent through the entire fight. This is going to make you a better angler at the end of the day. And that's what we all want. That's why I do this podcast. That's why we all listen to it, because we want to be better. Hey, I want to be better. I learn a ton as I go through and do this every week. It reminds me of lessons that I need to be better at, techniques that I need to be better at, right? We all want to improve and become better anglers. So why not start with the least thing we can do, which is barbless hooks? So, all right, I'll get off my soapbox here. And I'll try and answer your question directly. When the fish jump and you've got barbless hooks on, the big thing that I would urge you to not do is resist that urge to yank back on the rod. The fish jumps, you don't want to yank back on the rod. In fact, you want to let your rod tip dip just a tiny bit, because that fish jumps, it's going to hit the water, and as soon as it gets back in the water, it is going to take off swimming very quickly one direction or another. So you want to have just the tiniest bit of, not slack, but give in your line, so that when the fish does take off, it's not this huge sudden increase in pressure on your tippet and your leader, because that can cause both of those to snap, and then you lose a lot of fish that way. And then if you suddenly try to add or remove tension when the fish jumps, either by yanking back or by dropping your rod tip completely, at least with trout, it's different with other fish, but with trout especially, if you try to change the tension completely when the fish jumps, that hook can slip right on out of their mouth. So you want to just keep your rod at the same angle as before when the fish jump. Just let them jump. Don't move your rod too much. If anything, just relax a tiny bit, so maybe the tip of your rod dips like an inch or so at most. That gives the fish run to room once it hits the water again, or room to run, pardon me, once it hits the water again. Then just keep the tension on the line like you have throughout the rest of the fight. You'll be able to land the fish. Figuring out how to handle trout when they jump is really something you've got to learn by doing. It's really tough to describe everything that goes into it on a podcast. Maybe I'll try and find a jumpy fish one day, and we'll do a jumpy fish video on YouTube. But hopefully that helps. If you got any more questions, or if anybody else has any more tips about fighting fish or dealing with fish when they jump, definitely drop those below. But thanks so much for sending that question on in. Eamon from Utah has our next question, writes in and says, I inherited a 7/8 weight 10-foot rod, and I've been practicing casting a lot. I recently went with a friend who has a 5 weight 9.5 foot rod, and he let me try it. I instantly was able to cast and present my fly better. I don't have the budget to buy a new 5 weight fly rod right now. Any tips for fishing smaller streams with dry flies with a heavier rod? Eamon, congrats on getting into fishing, practicing with that rod. I hate to be the bearer of bad news here, but it's going to be really tough to fish small streams with dry flies of the 7/8 weight. And that was common with some of these older rods, was to give them 2 line weight designations. It's just going to be tough, man, because fly rods are rated based on the line they can throw. And we pick the fly line that we're going to use based on the size of flies that we want to throw. 7s and 8s. They're reserved almost exclusively for fishing very large nymph rigs and streamers. Okay, for an example, I use 8 weights when I'm salmon fishing up in Alaska, when I'm both fishing out in the ocean and in the rivers. I'm using that 8 weight. Eight weights are also very popular for bonefish, for pike and bass, and I even know a few crazy guys who throw eight weights for muskie, although a lot of the muskie anglers I know are fishing 9 and 10 weights because their flies are so stinking big. But the point is, for smaller dry fly work, a 7 and an 8 weight fly line is just way too heavy. It's just too much. It's not designed for smaller dry fly work. Your 3, your 4, and your 5 weights, that's your sweet spot for your dry flies, especially on smaller streams, because those weights are designed, again, with that dry fly use in mind. They're so much lighter. They're going to hit the water softer. They're going to present those flies with a lot more subtlety, a lot more delicacy. If you try to throw like a size 16 parachute Adams on the 7 weight, you'll be able to cast it out there, but that line's going to hit the water so hard, especially in a small stream, it's just going to spook every fish in the vicinity. So even if you fished a really long leader on it, it's not going to have the delicacy and subtlety you need to get the correct presentation. And as we know, your job is to put flies in front of fish and make them look real. And if you can't do the make them look real part of that equation, you're really going to have a tough time catching fish. So again, I don't like to be the bearer of bad news, but that's just not the right tool for the job with what you're trying to do. The good news, though, is that I do have a couple of old 7 weights. They're from the late 80s, and they fish if I could talk, that would be really helpful, right? They fish a lot more like modern 6-weight rods do. Rods have gotten a lot faster and a lot stiffer as the years have gone on, and I've tried throwing a double taper 6-weight line on those old 7-weight rods, and it works pretty well for dry fly fishing, although I wouldn't go with anything too small, like below a size 12. They're fun for really big hopper dropper rigs that those old 7 weights are, but I would not pick them for small stream fishing in the least, just because they're still too big. Even those older, slower rods are still just too much rod for what I'm trying to do. So you could maybe try sizing down to a 6-weight and see if that works, but that's just not what that rod is designed for. A 10-foot 7 or 8 weight, that's a saltwater fly rod. That's a pike rod. That's a bonefish rod. That's what that's designed for at that point. You honestly would be better off saving some cash and getting a 5-weight like the Fly Flinger that we sell here at VFC. You can buy just the rod for less than $200, which is very reasonable. And I love the Fly Flinger. If your goal is to fish dry flies in smaller streams, start setting the cash aside and doing that now, and you'll be much happier long term if you do that. So thanks for sending that question in. I appreciate it. Skylar from Iowa has our next question, writes in and says, "Hello, VFC crew. I've been fly fishing for about 2 months. Where I live in Iowa, there isn't really anywhere to fish for trout. I'd have to drive 3-ish hours to the driftless part of Iowa to get into some. So I go out on small rivers and streams and search a smallmouth. I'm just curious, is it a thing to use indicators when fishing woolly buggers, or is that kind of a goober thing to do? Thanks." Skylar, this is a great question. I know tons of anglers who fish woolly buggers underneath strike indicators or bobbers, whatever we want to call them, right? It's really a great way to imitate larger nymphs, crawdads, and really any other kind of fish food that's big. Maybe your bait fish or sculpin, like we were talking about earlier in the show. Drifting them underneath that indicator is a great way to get what we call a dead drift. Sometimes they'll drift when they're not moving. They'll just get knocked loose and drift with the current sometimes. The crawdads especially, you'll see that happen. So it can be a very effective way to imitate what food actually looks like in the river. And one of the biggest fish I've ever caught was actually on a dead drifted streamer, not a woolly bugger, but still a streamer. And I was up fishing this tiny little creek, and I was dead drifting a big woolly bugger through this little run. And the woolly bugger, or not the woolly bugger, pardon me, it was a bigger streamer, but it stops. And I set the hook and nothing moves. And so I thought I caught a log on the bottom of the river. And then the log jumped, and I about peed myself because I had never seen a fish that big before. It takes off downstream, and I chased it for like a quarter mile, actually down this little creek and into a lake. The fish took me all the way to backing. I ruined my waders because I slipped and fell in the river. and scratched them and tore them all up on rocks. But I ended up with a 26-inch cutthroat in the net. So it was 100% worth it at that point. But it was just caught on a dead drifted streamer, just letting it drift through there. It was a ton of fun. Very effective way to fish streamers sometimes. You can also use the indicator to help jig the streamers a little bit. If you toss your woolly bugger out there, what you can do is you can either twitch your rod tip or you can actually strip some line in to get that fly to bounce. So that woolly bugger will jig the fly up in the water column, but then it'll drop and it stops at that depth set by your strike indicator. And this can be really effective in riffles and runs when the fish are moving to eat bait fish, because sometimes those bait fish will move with that jiggy motion. They'll bounce and they don't just swim straight through the current. Sometimes they'll bounce, especially if they're injured. And trout really love injured prey. They love prey that's moving away from them. So giving just that little jiggy action even can be a really effective way, especially for the bass too, to get the fish to commit to eat. So long story short, 100%, it's an effective way to fish. Do it and you're going to see plenty of success. And definitely do not be afraid to add a little bit of action to those woolly buggers either as you're drifting them under that bobber. That wraps up the Q&A section of the show this week, folks, but don't go anywhere because we've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. Every week here at Untangled, we end the show by sharing a story and picture from folks who are out there in the VFC audience living real life, having adventures, spending time on the water, learning something, just, again, living real life. And we want to see and hear all about your adventures. So if you've got a live real life moment that you would like to share, there's a link to send those in down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. And this week's live real life moment is from Bryce, who writes in and says, "Hello. For the last year, I have felt the call of the river. I have fished in the past, but only a few times, and it was never something I sought out. Perhaps reaching my middle 30s or expecting my first child later this year has brought out the angler in me. But whatever the reason, I have been wanting to get into fishing. Up to this point, I have only ever used a spinning reel and live bait. Many trips have been more catching than fishing, and that isn't what I'm wanting to experience this time around. The idea of fly fishing has always fascinated me, the graceful cast and the lone fisherman standing in a river surrounded by raw natural beauty. Perhaps it's the poet in me, but I decided that if I'm going to get into fishing, I wanted to do it in the purest way possible. It didn't take long to find Ventures Fly Co. on the internet, and what a great resource to find. I quickly looked through many of your videos and decided that fly fishing is the path I would follow. After shopping around some and reading many Reddit posts, I learned that your starter kit is a great value and includes literally everything I need. I purchased your Weekend Warrior kit and waited excitedly for it to arrive. Isn't it always the way of winter that as it approaches, we find new interests that would be better learned in warmer months? Well, Indiana delivered a brutal winter storm, which made every body of water in our area froze solid. I knew I wouldn't be able to immediately get on the water anyway, so I used this time to learn the gear and plan what flies and rigs I would use after the thaw. Then this week, some warmer days occurred and water once again flowed throughout the land. Though I know it can be difficult to fish in winter, I couldn't wait any longer, and I found myself driving after work in the last remaining hour of sunlight to a local creek. With moments of sunlight left, I reached the water's edge, set up my rod, and tied on some flies. I pulled back and cast into the tree behind me. Luckily, I prepared myself mentally for this possibility, and I was able to untangle my line and continue. The evening resulted in many good casts and lots of learning, and at the end of my hour of sunlight, I went home with 3 fewer flies, 1 less indicator, and a smaller spool of tippet than I started with. But I was stoked. What fun! The creek I was at is so beautiful, and even though I only had a short amount of time before dark, I was filled with peace. So much, in fact, that I decided the very next day to return. With the same amount of sunlight as the day prior, well, 2 minutes more technically, I reached the water's edge. This time the flies went on much quicker and with more confidence. The cast felt natural and less clumsy. The drag-free drift became achievable, and after a few casts, a fish. I set the hook and patiently worked him towards my net, which was conveniently pulled from its magnetic mount. Knowing that I am new and wanting to avoid excessive harm to the fish as I learn unhooking techniques, I've been smashing down the barb on my hooks. As my first catch entered the net, the hook came out easily, and there he was. My first ever fish caught on a fly line. What a great feeling. I kept him in the water and only pulled him out for a brief picture and then returned him to his aquatic home. I was elated. I continued to fish for a while longer and ended up catching another, or the same fish. Having caught 2 fish, or 1 fish 2 times, and losing no flies and no indicators and snagging 0 trees, I departed the river and made my way home, feeling at peace with the world. Though this trip is not the substance of legends, knowing that I caught my first fish on a fly line with a barbless fly in January on my second day, second hour, made me feel pretty good. I look forward to many more memorable moments on the water. Thank you for all you do for the hobby, and I am very happy to now be a part of it. Bryce, I have absolutely nothing to add, man. That's the definition of live real life. Thank you so much for sharing that story. It was incredible. Well done. Hats off to you. That's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that experience. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap the show up this week. Thank you so much for being here, listening to the show every week. It means more to me than you can even imagine. If you want to help me and the rest of VFC out even more, make sure you rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can help live real life, which is the entire goal of VFC. We want folks to have the experience that Bryce just had. And with that in mind, turn the podcast off, go get out on the water this week, have some fun, and live real life.